was a famous serial killer, Ted Bundy, who basically said, there is no right and wrong. So you do whatever you feel like doing. And I feel like killing a bunch of women, which he did.
Yep.
And but he was feeling that way because there is no ultimate and objective right and wrong. Well, guess what? Deep down, we all know there is an objective right and wrong. I don't think anybody would say that torturing a baby for fun is morally neutral. Or morally good. It is morally wrong. It is wrong. And I think we would all agree to that. Well, if there is an objective moral line to be drawn, then that points toward the existence of a God who represents that line and on whom that line is based. So I think relativism is self-refuting logically. I think it's unlivable ultimately. And as Nietzsche said, hey, if there is no right and wrong, then anything goes. Anything goes. We can't live that way.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad you joined us today. And if you are new here, make sure you subscribe. You'll never miss an episode because this is where I sit down with world-class leaders like today's guest, Lee Strobel. Few people have done as much for apologetics and evangelism as Lee has over the last 30 years. And he's an absolute legend. We talk about how to share truth with people who don't believe in truth anymore and the future of evangelism. And today's episode is brought to you by the Church Network. So church leaders, the race you're running is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You don't want to go it alone. So check out the Church Network Conference. It's for operational church leaders, July 9th through 12th in Lexington, Kentucky. You can register today at thechurchnetwork.com/2024 conference. And today's episode is brought to you by Compassion. Is your church united both locally and globally? So I've partnered with Compassion for years, and our church over the years has held some very special weekends where we've come together and focused beyond ourselves on something much bigger than us, and Compassion helps us do that. Our church sponsors kids in Guatemala. I personally sponsor kids in Guatemala. And you know what? That is a way to unite because poverty stops when the churches unite. So you can visit compassion.com/Carey to get started and learn more. And now, my conversation with Lee Strobel. Lee, this is long overdue. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Carey. It's great to be with you. I mean, I am a huge fan of what you do. I think you are a great voice for leadership in the church. And I was telling Leslie that whenever I read something you've produced, whether it's an email that you send out on leadership or whatever, I always walk away saying, hey, I learned something. This is fresh. This is new. And I can use it. It's practical. And so I as we text and say, I appreciate you.
Well, listen, I am so humbled to hear that and so grateful. One of the great joys of my life right now is I get to talk to some of the people that honestly have impacted me for decades. And you would be near the top of that list. I mean, sitting in the back row, taking notes, never thinking I'd ever even say hello, but to know that we're connected digitally and to even know that you're an email subscriber, like that means a lot. That means an awful lot, Lee.
Well, I enjoy it. I look forward to getting them. When I see a new one, I jump in, read it right away.
Well, we send enough of them. So that's great. Well, Lee, okay, behind you, I was asking you before we hit recording, I'm like, I can just make it out. Ford ignored Pinto fire peril, secret memo show. Yeah. So tell me about that newspaper clip. First of all, what was that? Was that the 80s, the 70s? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Ford Pinto.
Yeah. Oh, you are? Okay.
A buddy of mine in high school had one. It was a hand-me-down car. And we were always joking about exploding Pintos. Is this the day we're all going to blow up in a ball of fire?
Well, Ford, for the first time in American history, was charged with reckless homicide for the way it designed the Ford Pinto, which is a subcompact car that when hit from behind in a low or moderate speed collision tended to explode. And I think 60 some odd people were killed in Pinto accidents.
Didn't mean to joke about that. I was in high school though,
No, I get it. Yeah. And so there's just 3 teenage girls who were burned to death in a Pinto who would have walked away with virtually no injuries had the car been appropriately designed to not blow up when hit from behind. And so they were charged. I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. I was covering the case, and I got a tip from somebody that said, you ought to check the public file on that case. So I go down and I look, and there's a a bunch of what they call motions in limine. You have a legal background, right, Carey?
Yeah. I went to law school.
There are motions in limine, which means Ford was saying, we don't want to talk about this stuff, so let's litigate it in advance so it doesn't come up at the trial. Well, attached to those motions were secret memos from Ford showing that they knew in advance from the crash test how dangerous this car was, and they didn't want to fix it because first of all, you couldn't put golf clubs in the trunk if they fixed it, and also it would have cost $3 or something a car, and they're making millions of cars. So I published the memos, and it was a big national story for a while. And I actually wrote a book. My first book was called Reckless Homicide, about the Ford Pinto case, which I covered. Ford was acquitted, by the way, because they couldn't establish that the year of the Pinto that was in the accident. It was a couple of years after the initiation of the car, the introduction of the car, and the crash tests were from the first year, and so the jury found them not guilty.
Yeah.
But anyway, and I won some awards for it, and so that's what that is on my wall.
Investigative journalism. I mean, that was almost just after the era of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and the Watergate investigations,
right?
Et cetera. Man, things have changed.
It was an exciting time. Mm-hmm. You know, I was in journalism school when that whole thing blew up, and with Nixon and so forth, and so it was big to go into journalism back then. It was very different than it is today, but that's a whole other discussion.
How did you get into investigative journalism, and particularly the legal beat? Do you have a legal background?
My dad was a lawyer. I was always interested in law. One of the things, I was a general assignment reporter, and then they assigned me to cover criminal courts and then federal courts. And so I got very involved with litigation and covering things like that. And then I went to Yale Law School to get a Master of Studies in Law degree, which is designed for people that don't want to practice law, but want to write about it or teach about it and so forth. And so I became legal editor, which meant I covered major cases from the Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, the legal profession, major trials around the country. And so I really enjoyed it. I love the legal process is fascinating to me. I tend to have a very systematic mind, and I like the way lawyers think.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You know, thinking about what I do today, one of the questions I got right after I graduated seminary, because my background was history and poli-sci, followed by the full law thing. I worked for a year in downtown Toronto, articled as a student, wrote the bar admission course, resigned, went into seminary. So one of the first questions in the first few years of ministry was, do you ever use your law degree? And I was like, no, not really. Like, I'm not negotiating contracts. I'm not reviewing legal documents. I'm not litigating any of that. And so my answer was no. And in the last 15 years, I've pivoted and said, no, my answer is I use it every day.
Yeah.
Because law reshapes how you think.
Absolutely.
It reshapes your mind.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, what did law, it's going to be a funny question. What did law do to your mind? Like, how did it reshape it? And how has that come to bear on what you can offer the church is the second part of the question.
It definitely reshaped it. It caused me to ask questions that go deeper and to think systematically about things, to analyze things. And so when I was an atheist, which I was when I was a young man and working at the Chicago Tribune, and my wife became a Christian, and I thought, well, I need to rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in. So I decided to use my legal training and my journalism training, and that way I could kind of systematically investigate what is the evidence, especially for the resurrection of Jesus. So I was able to use the kind of legal analysis to probe and to try to determine, is there any evidence from science? Are there any arguments from philosophy? Is there any evidence from history in terms of the resurrection that is convincing about the truth of Christianity? So definitely my legal background, I think, kind of prepared me in a unique way to investigate these things.
What got you interested in the first place in even asking spiritual questions?
It really was my wife's conversion. We got married young. I was 20, she was 19. We met when we were 14.
Sounds like a Christian marriage, but it's not. It wasn't, right? Yeah.
Don't say that, because my 18-year-old granddaughter is dating a guy right now, and she's serious with.
Okay. Don't tell her about this podcast. Okay?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But when she became a Christian, I freaked out. And I didn't want to be married. First word that went through my mind was divorce when she told me I was going to walk out. And then I thought maybe, even as an atheist, I recognized that the resurrection was pivotal, because Jesus clearly made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. And so the question is, did he return from the dead and thus prove he is who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God? And so that's what got me involved. I didn't know what apologetics was. I'd never studied these issues before. I wasn't a particularly spiritual person. I denied that God existed. I was kind of a hard-headed, hard-hearted atheist. I was a heavy drinker. I was a narcissist. I lived a very immoral life. And it was really prompted by my wife's conversion that I began to delve into these issues for the first time and became fascinated. Because, when I was a little kid, my parents gave me this punching bag. I don't know if you ever saw these, but they were weighted on, they were inflatable, and they were weighted on the bottom. Remember these? And you'd hit them and they'd fall back and then they'd pop up again. You'd hit them again. It was kind of a toy. So that's how my investigation was, because I figured I'm going to hit Christianity with my biggest objection. Boom. And I would hit it. And it would go down, but then boom, it bounced back up. I'd find answers. I'd find evidence. I said, doggone it. So I'd hit it again and it would go down, but then it would bounce back up and there's answers. And it just shocked me. It honestly shocked me that there was any substance and historical and scientific validity to the claims of Christianity. And I spent 2 years of my life doing that. And that's what changed everything when I came to faith on November the 8th of 1981. And eventually left my journalism career at a 60% pay cut to join the staff of a church, as we're all used to. Yeah. And, it's been an unexpected adventure ever since.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember reading, if I remember correctly, that you had set out on this investigation to debunk Christianity, basically to say to Leslie, here's why you're wrong.
That was my hope. I approached it as a good journalist back then would do, which is to try to be objective, to try to call a ball and a strike a strike. So I tried to be honest and objective. But my hope was I could liberate her from this cult that she's gotten involved in and have my old Leslie back and go back to our old life. And that was my hope. But I did try to be honest and to look at both sides, and as I was taught to do as a journalist.
So what was it that helped convince you? Obviously, intellect is a huge part of that. Yeah. I tend to live and lead with my mind, not so much with my heart. That's just my own bias. I don't know whether yours is that. And we can say the name of the church if you're comfortable. I mean, there's obviously been some challenges at Willow over the years, and we've picked those apart in other episodes and taken a look at it. So we don't need to do that today. But in the early days of Willow, was there anything other than the intellectual evidence? Like, I'm thinking about, because church leaders are dealing with this now, and you read my material, so you probably heard me talk about it. Like, content is one thing, but community and connection are really part of it. If I remember right, your wife was involved in a Bible study or something like that, in community. What role did community and connection play in your conversion, I guess, is my question.
Well, it's interesting that Willow Creek was known as an attractional model of church, which meant that the weekend services were designed for people like me, skeptics, doubters, people who are spiritual seekers, and so forth. And then the worship services for Christians took place on Wednesday night. But it's a little deceiving to say that, because it's not just an attractional model, it was a relational model as well. We had a strategy, and the first step of the strategy for Christians at the church was to build an authentic relationship with someone far from God. The second step was to share your testimony, to share Jesus with them. And then the third step was to invite them to a weekend service. So it was a very relational environment. And I thought it was very transparent and very authentic. And they were dealing and wrestling with questions that I began to wrestle with as I did my spiritual investigation. And the deeper I got into the church in terms of attending and meeting people and asking questions, I found a very open environment. And they seemed to be willing to engage with these things. And they shocked me because they would use drama back then.
Yeah, I
remember that? And they would do these short dramas that were maybe 5 to 7 to 10 minutes long. And what happened was I came in as a skeptic with my arms figuratively folded over my chest, like, yeah, I dare you to tell me something relevant to my life. And then the drama would sneak around behind me and catch me from behind and surprise me with an insight that it's not a objective, analytical, empirical bit of evidence, but it was dealing with the emotions and dealing with the psychological side and dealing with the human side and the interpersonal side. And it would surprise me and shock me. And so I attended, and I would get mad. I would hear something and it would make me angry, and I wouldn't come back for a couple of weeks. But then I thought, oh, maybe that does make sense. And I'd go back, and there was kind of a love-hate relationship going on. But my wife got involved with women's studies at the church, Bible studies and things like that. She told this one woman named Sylvia that I have no hope for my husband. You know, he's the hard-hearted legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He's never going to bend his knee to Jesus. And Sylvia put her arm on Leslie's shoulder and pulled her to the side and said, no one's beyond hope. And so she met a lot of really good people who were praying for me and who were helping her grow in her faith. And what was happening was I would see positive aspects of her faith, the way she related to me and the children, the way she loved me, the way she was more tolerant of my doubts than she had been in the past. It was winsome and it was attractive, and it began to pull me toward faith. So I had this pull and push thing going on. I really owe Willow Creek a lot because it was a safe place to hear a very dangerous message.
What was the turning point? I mean, you have a very specific date in which you remember. Some of us have seasons. Sure. I don't have a date. I got a season. I got a couple of seasons in my life. Yep. One as a teenager, one as a 21, 22-year-old. Yep. But you have a date. What was the inflection or turning point that made you walk across that line and say, that's it, I give up?
It was a Sunday, November the 8th of 1981. I went to church to Willow Creek with my wife that morning. I came home. I have no recollection of what was said at that service. But I thought, you know what? I've been investigating this for a year and 9 months. A good juror reaches a verdict, and the evidence is in. You've really plumbed this thing as deeply as I think you're going to plumb it. You need to reach a verdict. And so I sat down with the evidence I'd accumulated over those 2 years, books and articles and documents and things. And I kind of reviewed it one last time. And then I kind of sat back and I said, wait a second. In light of this avalanche of evidence that points so powerfully toward the truth of Christianity, it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. And the scales just went like that. And that's when I reached my verdict that based on the largely the historical data for the resurrection of Jesus, I was convinced that he not only claimed to be the Son of God, he backed it up by returning from the dead. And then I didn't know what to do. Am I done? Honestly, I thought, okay, I've just spent 2 years. I'm done. I'll just go on with my life. And Leslie pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12 says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And so in my legal mind, I look at that and I see an equation of what it means to become a child of God with the key words, believe plus receive equals become. So I said, I get it. I believe based on the data that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, backed it up by his resurrection. I get it. I believe it. But that wasn't enough. I had to receive this free gift of grace. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, in this prayer of repentance and faith, I received this gift of forgiveness and eternal life. And my life began to change in radical ways immediately.
I can see it's still emotional.
Yeah, it was. I think about it sometimes. I'll tell my story and I'll kind of relive it as I tell my story. It's hard not to get emotional when you think about that moment that God entered into your life and the light bulb goes on and all of a sudden you see things differently. And now you're reading the Bible with fresh eyes. And now you learn how to worship and you learn how to pray and you develop these deep and enduring and profound friendships and relationships with other followers of Jesus and connect into a church. It's the best thing ever happened to me.
So what then? You continued as legal affairs editor, and it was how many years until the first Case 4 series that you became so well known for? Many years. Yeah, it's quite a while.
Yeah, I ended up becoming editor of a newspaper in Missouri, and then I went back to Chicago because honestly, I missed Willow Creek. And eventually in 1987, came on the staff of the church, initially in a more administrative role. I was head of service ministries, which meant I had 740 volunteers underneath me. Yeah. And so I would organize that. And then I was associate director of evangelism with a guy I just met at the church named Mark Middleburg. Right. Well, we became best friends, and they're still best friends. And then later, I was mentored in theology by Mark and in preaching by Bill Hybels. And the elders came to me one day and said, "We believe God's given you a gift to preach and to share Jesus, and we want you to develop that." And they gave me some baby steps to take, and all of a sudden, I find myself in front of thousands of people talking about Jesus. So, leaving my career, and the only thing I knew, and I trained my whole life for this. I mean, a journalism degree, law degree, and so forth. That was all I ever knew. It was one of the easiest decisions in my life because I felt God's call. I felt like I cannot not do this because I would picture what's it going to be like on my deathbed. And I'm laying there with my head on the pillow. And I think back to this moment and I think, no, I chickened out. I said no to God. And what did I miss? I would never know. And I couldn't tolerate that. I couldn't deal with that. And so it was really an easy decision because it was such a clear calling to leave all that behind, to take the pay cut, to come on the staff of the church, to start at this very modest position. And I didn't write anything for quite a while. I think my first book was called Inside the Mind of Unchurched Harry and Mary. It was
I remember that one. Remember that one? I had that one, yeah.
Understanding the mindset of people like me who are skeptics. And I think that came out in the 90s, 94 or something like that. I didn't write Case for Christ till 98, or it didn't come out till 98. And I wasn't planning to write another book. It was my wife's idea. And so.
Yeah. Here we are all these years later, and there have been a few books, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about apologetics a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, we've hinted at it already, but so much has changed. And, I'm of the age where I remember the 80s and the 90s, and there's a general agreement around truth. Yeah. But one of the hallmarks of postmodernism and post-Christian America is truth has gone from objective to subjective. I have my truth, you have your truth.
Right.
Truth is a feeling, an emotion as much as it is anything empirical. What do you take of that shift away, and how is that changed, or how has that been changing the field of apologetics?
It really means that if we're going to share Jesus with people who are skeptical and doubters, that we have to take a step back and not immediately dive into the evidence, whether it's science or history or whatever, or even philosophical arguments. We have to take a step back and make sure we're on common ground regarding truth. You're right. There's a lot of people who have a relativistic belief there is no absolute truth. And we have to point out to them that, go back to Plato, go back to Aristotle, and the seeds are there for understanding what truth is. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. That is truth. It's not an opinion. I can say chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla, but maybe it isn't to you. That's an opinion. That's not truth. And so truth is whatever corresponds to reality. The idea of relativism is self-refuting. Because to say that there is absolutely no absolute truth is to make a self-refuting statement. So it doesn't stand up to philosophy, doesn't stand up to rationality, because if there is no truth, if there is no ultimate and objective morality, then how can we even live in the culture? Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous atheist, said, if there is no God, if there is no objective morality, then anything is permissible. Anything goes. And that's true. And so the question...
I think we're living through that
we are.
Right now,
we are
right?
In a large degree. So we have to kind of step back and say, Pontius Pilate asked the question, what is truth? Let's talk about that first and come to an agreement that truth is that which corresponds to reality. So I can say truthfully, I'm in Texas at this moment. And why is that true? Because I'm sitting in my home just north of Houston, Texas. But if I were to say I'm in Louisiana right now, that would be false because it doesn't correspond to reality. The reality is I am here in the state of Texas. So we have to step back. We have to educate people on what truth is so that we can then take the next step to look at what is the truth? What is reality about God?
Yeah, and so you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, I have that legal training as well, and I have no problem with the idea of objective empirical truth. But I see it falling on harder and harder ground all the time.
Yes.
With people going, yeah, well, that's what you believe. I don't believe it. On the other hand, the analogy I've used sometimes in personal conversation, and to make this timely, we're renovating my office right now. I had an electrician in last week. I certainly hope that he has wired this place according to some empirical standard, because if you get those wires crossed, we're in a house fire. And things go terribly wrong. Like, the objective truth of a well-engineered building, a car that is in good repair, as opposed to a car where there's, or honestly, everything Boeing's going through lately with parts flying off of aircraft, right? Like there's an empirical sense of right or wrong.
Yes.
I think most of us would probably say, yeah, that's actually true. But somehow when it comes to the metaphysical or, the eternal or the spiritual, people think the rules don't apply.
Yeah, you have to say, is there an exception for spiritual beliefs and so forth?
Yeah, that's fair.
You say, wait a second. Okay, let's just think about that logically. Christianity makes certain claims. Islam makes certain claims. Let's look at the claims of Islam. Islam says in Surah 4, verse 156, 157 or so, it says, Jesus did not die on the cross and therefore is not resurrected. It says that God does not have a son. The Quran also says that nobody can bear the sins of another. Well, those are three specific teachings that Christianity affirms. So either they're both wrong, Christianity and Islam are both wrong, or one of them is right, but it's impossible for them to be right at the same time because the law of non-contradiction tells us that two things that fundamentally contradict each other in the same way at the same time cannot be true simultaneously. So, what you just did with your illustration about the electricity is a great example of how we can help people as we begin to engage with them to get to this common ground. And sometimes you have to say, okay, grant this to me for now, and let's see where it goes. And maybe you're not convinced yet that there is an objective truth, but let's grant it to me temporarily so that I can kind of make my case, and then you can evaluate it. But what you did is a great example of how you might talk to a person who is doubtful about the existence of objective truth, and then get to the evidence for the Christian faith from there.
Well, it at least establishes common ground.
Yeah.
At least we can agree there's a way to wire your house. There's a way to build an airplane, and you have some discretion in that, but if parts are falling off, that's not a good plan.
Right.
Do you find, because I think another characteristic of our age, Lee, and you've been writing for decades, but another characteristic of our age is I've never heard more conversation about generations than I do right now. Maybe in the 60s, I don't remember the 60s. Maybe in the 60s, it was, the hippies versus the world. Yeah. But now we have Gen Z, we have Gen Alpha, we have Millennials, we got Gen X and Boomers and all that. And some people would say, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, that logical train of thought is really a boomer mindset. And so when you're dealing with Gen Z or millennials who probably have that more, hey, truth is subjective, whatever, do you find that when they sort through the arguments, they accept it? Or do you find that to be a tougher audience for the kind of message that you give and that we're talking about today?
Well, I'd say a couple things. I'd say, first of all, there are a lot of cultural currents that are drawing people and pulling people away from this idea that there is logic, there is rationality, there is evidence, and so forth. But on the other hand, we are a rational species. God is a rational God. And God created us in his image. And so it may be kind of encrusted by a lot of cultural junk, but deep inside, we're all rational, I believe. And yes, some generations, because of the influences of the culture, may be a little lost and confused. But when you dig deep enough, I think we're all ultimately pretty rational in our approach to life. And what I found is Generation Z, for instance, young people. I have a friend named Shane Pruitt. Do you know Shane?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay. So Shane's ministry is to travel the country and speak to young people about God.
Yeah, we've met. Mm-hmm.
Oh, have you? Okay. So he speaks to high school kids and college students and so forth. And he said, Lee, I've had more young people come to faith in Christ in the last 3 years than in the previous 18 years of ministry combined. Wow. So we're seeing curiosity among young people. We're seeing a search. We're seeing they're looking at the culture. They're looking at things. There's just a study recently that showed that America is no longer in the top 20 countries in the world in terms of happiness. People are not happy. People are stressed. People are full of anxiety, depression. Mm-hmm. You look at the rates of depression, especially among young women, it's through the roof. And they're in the midst of that. And as a result, it's the old thing that Rick Warren used to say, when you hit bottom, there's nothing to do but look up. And so I think a lot of young people are starting to look up. They're starting to be open to the idea of God. And, when we listen to them and we let them tell us their stories and we validate them as people who are on a spiritual journey, and yes, we haven't come out at the same place yet, but that's okay. We respect them and we take time with them. And we honor them as people made in God's image. They love to talk about this stuff. I found that young people especially love to discuss spiritual stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's a great starting point. That's why one of the most exciting things I see in evangelism in local churches these days are what we call spiritual discovery groups for non-believers to go on a journey with a Christian couple or two Christians who lead the group, to investigate, to look into, talk about, to interact with each other on spiritual questions. And these are gangbusters. And I think it's a fruitful area of ministry because especially young people are more interested in story oftentimes than statistics. And so that's great. Let's talk story. We have the greatest story ever told.
I love how that fuses informational and relational. And I mean, we use Alpha at our church, not a sponsor of this podcast or anything, but I'm a huge fan. It's relational and informational. Yep. I'm making this term up so we can move on if there's no fruit here. But being wired the way you're wired and the way I'm kind of naturally wired, logic does matter to me. And I have a hard time with inconsistencies. Yeah. Let's put it that way. Yeah. And so I want to think of these as logical trip lines. Mm-hmm. So, for example, someone might say, well, objective morality is completely subjective. It really doesn't matter. For example, it could be one of the reasons, I've read this somewhere. I haven't got the exact stat, but it's something like, the reason a lot of people resist Christianity in their 20s is because of our sexual teachings. And so they come back in their 30s when they've sort of sorted that stuff out and settled down a little bit. And I don't want to discount that. I think that's possible. And so people might say, well, that's just an old-fashioned morality, et cetera. However, and it's all subjective. It's right for me. It's right for them. Then it's fine, whatever. Yeah. But on the other hand, so they say there's no objective morality, but you quote Sartre. Immanuel Kant tried to find this on his own, during the Enlightenment. Many other people have tried, but I think we all have that moral fault line where, well, love is what you want to make it. Yet, if I'm with you and you cheat on me, we all feel wronged.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? There's
Sure.
something almost universal.
Yeah.
And I know polyamory is sort of a thing right now. It's having a moment. But for 98% of the people, it's like, no, you cheat on me, I feel wronged. You take property that was mine, I feel wronged.
Right.
Can you talk about logical trip lines or anything else that sort of helps somebody who's sort of lost in that sea of subjectivity to go, wait a minute, I think I agree with that.
Yeah, when we feel those emotions of I was cheated on, I feel wronged, somebody stole something from me, I feel wrong, we're assuming there is a plumb line of rightness.
Somewhere. Exactly.
Of goodness.
It's a
somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And where does that come from? Where does that come from? If there is no God, there is no absolute foundation for right and wrong. There's only opinion. There's only subjective analysis and so forth. And so when we feel wrong, we're assuming there is some standard. If I take a test at college and I get 90% out of it, that assumes there's a standard of 100%, which is a perfect paper. And you've deviated from that and you get a 90% or whatever. But it assumes that there is an absolute standard. We can't really live. It's, one of the things I do in my book, Is God Real, is I analyze the three possible worldviews. Theism, there is a God. Atheism, there is no God, and pantheism, everything is God. Those are the only three real basic worldviews. And we analyze that from the perspective of livability and of logic. And livability is important. There was a famous serial killer, Ted Bundy, who basically said, there is no right and wrong. So you do whatever you feel like doing, and I feel like killing a bunch of women, which he did.
Yep.
And but he was feeling that way because there is no ultimate and objective right and wrong. Well, guess what? Deep down, we all know there is an objective right and wrong. I don't think anybody would say that torturing a baby for fun is morally neutral or morally good. It is morally wrong. It is wrong. And I think we would all agree to that. Well, if there is an objective moral line to be drawn, then that points toward the existence of a God who represents that line and on whom that line is based. So it's. I think relativism is self-refuting logically. I think it's unlivable ultimately. And as Nietzsche said, hey, if there is no right and wrong, then anything goes. Anything goes. We can't live that way. And I think deep down, we all know that. And that's why we get mad when we get cheated on or stolen from.
See, I think those are great examples of logical trip lines. If you take there is no morality, I can kill who I want, women, men, whatever, or torturing babies, there is a deep revulsion about that by everybody except perhaps 0.001% of a sociopathic psychopath.
Who we would agree are sociopaths or psychopaths.
Exactly. Psychopathic population, etc. So I'm glad this was good because I think what we have now in the first 40 minutes of this conversation, 35 minutes, is some tools that people can put in their back pocket. Because, when someone says, I don't really believe that there is a right and wrong, a lot of us just freeze up, right? Yeah. And we're like, I don't know what to say. So it could be, electricity, there's a right and wrong, physics of flight, there's a right and wrong, a suspension bridge. Right. Hopefully the engineers were paying attention and we got lots of historic examples when they got a calculation wrong. Right. Or this idea of torturing babies or murdering people or stealing property or cheating on someone that you promised you wouldn't cheat on. Right. That all those are great examples.
Those hit deeply. Yeah.
Excellent. Because I think we need some new tools. So I was going to say, I guess the next layer of that question for me is all the wave of deconversions that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Do you have a take on deconversion and deconstruction that's happening right now? Because it seems like the arguments are solid, but people keep walking away. Any thoughts on that cultural phenomena?
Yeah, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but it's interesting that when Tim Keller, the Presbyterian pastor who passed away recently in New York City, great thinker and author, and when a young man would come up to Tim Keller and say, "Yeah, I'm kind of deconstructing I'm kind of asking these tough questions. I'm not sure anymore," and he would reply by saying, "Oh, what's her name?"
Oh, who are you falling in love with?
Because so often there is a motivation, a hidden motivation that I don't like what the Bible teaches about X, Y, or Z. I don't like what it teaches about sexuality. And I got this hot girlfriend, and frankly, I'm kind of questioning Christianity now. I'm not quite so sure it's true. And I think that I don't want to say that always drives things, but many times I've seen that there is a subterranean motivation in people trying to walk away from their faith and finding good reasons to not believe. Because as my friend Mark Middleberg said, if you don't want to believe, any reason is good enough. You can always find a reason and say, "Oh, I don't believe because of this," and just walk away. So I think that people have always questioned their faith, but I think right now it's become there's almost a social contagion of this. It's like I was reading about an elementary school teacher who said recently that 11 students in her classroom are trans. And I go, what are the odds of that mathematically? Is there something else going on here? Is there a cultural movement? Is there a social contagion going on? And I think the answer is clearly yes. And I think, you will be applauded by our culture so much more if you deconvert from faith than if you convert to faith. If you're at Indiana University as a student or wherever, and you are questioning things and walking away from Christianity, you're not going to find a lot of people who are going to discourage you from doing that. They're going to be applauding you. You come to a radical faith in Christ, and all of a sudden you're going to lose friends, and you're going to feel very ostracized in that culture. So I think there's some social reasons. I think there's some hidden reasons. I think there's also the Kanye West just recently said, "I am God." He said, "I am the God of my life." And that is the way so many people feel. It's like, you know what? I'm tired of trying to follow somebody else. I'm the God of my life, doggone it. And I'm going to decide what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do. And oh, by the way, I love these new trends of polyamorism or whatever it is, I'm going to kind of walk down that path. So it opens us up to doing whatever we feel like doing. And that's been historic. People want to be God. They want to be their own God. So I think there's a lot of motivations. I don't think it's bad for people to question things. I encourage people to have a faith that they understand and that makes sense to them. And I engage with a lot of people who are kind of asking tough questions about their beliefs, and sit down with them and have a conversation. And I hope it's helpful. But the other trend we're seeing, which I think is kind of related, is this trend of the increase in the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who have no religious affiliation. And not all of them are atheists. Many of them
No, quite a few have a somewhat spiritual, biblical worldview.
Right. And I applaud this movement. I think the rise of the nuns is a good thing. And the reason is, back when I was a kid in the 1960s or late 50s, if you asked an American, "Are you a Christian?" "Oh, of course. Yeah, I'm a Republican. Of course. I live in America. Of course I'm a Christian." Were they Christians? No, of course not. These days, they don't pretend anymore because there's no social capital in claiming that you're a devout follower of Jesus anymore. Back then there was, and people. So my point is, a lot of people who years ago would have identified as a Christian, even though they weren't, are more willing today to say, "Nah, I'm kind of floating out there. I'm not quite sure what I believe, and I'm not affiliated with any church or anything." I would rather deal with those people who are being honest than people who make the claim that they were followers of Jesus because of social approval, and were not really. So I think the rise of the nuns is probably just a reflection of the reality that not everybody who claimed to be Christians are Christians. When I met my wife, Leslie, in 1966, when we were freshmen in high school, 98% of people in the United States said they were Christians. Or said they believe in God. 98% said they believe in God. Now, today, the number's 87%, the lowest in history. Do I find that discouraging? Well, on one level, yeah, but on another level, no, because it's much more reflective of reality. Did I think that 98% of people in 1966 were truly devoted to following God? No. There'd be a whole different culture if that were true. And so I am glad people are being more honest these days. And if a person says, I'm kind of deconstructing my faith, and if that is defined by merely asking questions about why to believe what I believe, do I really have confidence that this is true? That's okay. Let's talk about it. Let's deal with it. But often, as I say, there are subterranean motivations that are driving it that have nothing to do with truth, and usually a lot more to do with sex, to be honest.
What do you do with your own doubts?
I don't know that I have doubts. I have questions. I don't have anything that challenges my faith, but I get questions all the time that come up. And, fortunately, trained in journalism and law, I can pick up the phone and I'll just call an expert. I'll find a book on the topic and I'll just call up the person wherever what university they're at or whatever, and say, hey, can I talk to you for 5 minutes? I got a couple of questions to clarify this issue. So, And some things, frankly, we're going to have to hold in tension. We're not going to get a great answer in this world, which is logical to do if you have sufficient evidence to confirm the basic truth of your faith. But someday we're going to get to heaven, and I'm going to have my hand in the air and say, hey, Jesus, hey, how does this Arminianism and Calvinism thing really work? How does that fit together? We may not get an answer in this world. But that's okay. We can hold that in tension as long as we have confidence in the foundational evidence for the faith.
So this is an interesting question. I mean, I'm sure no one's really surprised. You've investigated this, written dozens of books, et cetera, et cetera. But you could also a cynic would make the argument, well, of course, you've sold millions of books. The empire is resting on the fact that you're not going to have any questions. What advice would you have for leaders who are listening, who maybe haven't sold 10 million books or whatever, but they lead a church, they're in some visible role, but they have questions, they have doubts, they're wondering if they're going to deconvert. Any thoughts for them?
Well, as you've pointed out in some of the things you've written, one of the crises among church leaders is a lack of authentic friendships and a relationship with someone who they can share the deepest emotions and feelings and doubts that creep into their life. Because we all go through eras where we have questions and are uncertain about things, or a little less strong in our faith today than we were yesterday. But how many pastors, how many church leaders have someone in their life who they can trust with that? And I get it. If you're a senior pastor of a church, you're disinclined to have someone, say, from your congregation who you're sharing intimate, secrets with and doubts with and so forth. So, I'm fortunate in that Mark Middleberg and I have been close friends since 1987. There isn't a day that goes by that we don't talk. He knows everything about me. I know everything about him. And when I have a doubt or I have a question, I'll say, I was thinking, what about X, Y, and Z? And he said, yeah, I've thought about that too. And I read a book recently and it said this and this, and I found it very helpful. Oh yeah, that's helpful to me too. You need someone. We have a loneliness epidemic in our culture anyway. But when you get to leaders of ministries, the loneliness factor goes through the roof. We've got to solve that.
Well, and that gets into tribe too, right? Because if you start hanging out with a bunch of deconversionists, then you're probably going to go in that direction. On the other hand, I think there does need to be safe space to ask really difficult. Sometimes I've got a small group of people that I will have discussions with, not every week, but on a regular basis about, and I don't want to say what they are right now on the podcast, but some of my They don't go to conversion. They don't go to I really believe Jesus is who he said he was. But they go to some of the issues that the church is dealing with right now. And if you have a healthy outlet for that, I think that can be really, really good. And ideally, I want, because I got enough voices in my ear of the deconverted and the people who are skeptics and the people who aren't convinced.
Yeah.
You do need a couple of people who maybe are a season ahead that you can look up to. And, like a Tim Keller, like somebody like that, who's like, oh no, these guys have been down that road before me.
Let me ask you a question, Carey,
right. Yeah,
if I can ask you one.
You can.
With your experience in church leadership, what percentage of senior pastors would you guess, I know it's a guess, but what percentage of them would have something like that in their life? A person or a small group of people who they can be completely take down the mask and be totally themselves and wrestle with kind of the things that everybody wrestles with, but which you're reluctant as a senior pastor to publicly concede that you're wrestling with because it might hurt your credibility. What percentage have that?
I can give you an exact percentage because I was just looking at the numbers. I just called it up while you were asking the question. I'm like, I don't have to guess on this one.
Okay.
This is Barna, State of Pastors. And it makes me emotional to even share this. So if you're over 45, 27% say they have excellent relationships. Yeah. If you're under 45, 18%. So 82% of church leaders under the age of 45 do not have great relationships. And that's the first layer. This isn't, do you have a best friend you can go to and ask anything about? This is just, are your relationships in good shape?
Yeah.
27% for over 45, 18% for under 45. Wow. It's awful. And I do this thing called the Art of Leadership Academy. We're having active conversations in there right now, like this week, about how to build better friendships. Yeah. Because it's at a crisis level. And I got a text from a mentor of mine yesterday, and it's a picture. Gosh, now I am going to get emotional. But Chuck sent this to me, and it's a picture of me in 2003. Ta-da. Oh, well, it was the wrong direction, wrong orientation. I fixed it in the Photos app. Let's see if I can call it up. Here's me, for those of you watching on YouTube. In 2003, horribly exposed photo, but I'm there in the back row. And this is a group of people called Pastors of Excellence, for those of you in Ashland, Ohio, at Ashland Seminary. I used to go there for about 2 or 3 years, and we were in these little cohorts. And that happened before I burned out. It probably saved my life and my ministry and my marriage and a million other things. I had so many blind spots as a leader. And it was one of my mentors, Chuck, who kind of tricked me into going there. One of the best things that ever happened. And I've learned the value of enduring friendships. I learned the value of having someone to track with. So honestly, Lee, and you'd probably say the same thing, I'm guessing, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have. I would have been roadkill. I would have been a casualty.
Yeah. So, and maybe, as you know, it's not just church leaders, it's men in general. Men just don't have these kind of relationships. And I actually wrote a book, one of my first Christian books, called God's Outrageous Claims. And I have a whole chapter there about how God can cure our affliction with loneliness. And, when I delved into the stats about just the average guy, we have all these cultural things pushing against those kind of relationships, and very few guys know what it's like to have somebody like I have with Mark. That I thank God for Mark, and Mark has saved me so many times from going off a cliff because he knows me and I trust him, and he's there for me. And
that's the thing. I could go off the cliff.
We all can.
I'm not beyond that.
That's right.
And your old colleague, John Ortberg's very similar. He has someone he calls every day, every single day, and they know everything about each other. So, wow, glad. That's going to help a lot of young leaders listening. Okay, I want to dive into Apologetics, your new book, the whole deal. But I want to know, what are the best arguments the skeptics are making these days?
We're seeing a lot of cultural apologetics and challenges, with gender issues and things like that. But I think one of the most effective, from the skeptic's position, arguments against God these days is what's called the divine hiddenness objection to God. John Steingart, who was the front man for a Christian rock group called, what was it called? Hawk Nelson.
Yeah.
Remember them?
They're from my area.
Oh,
That's
they are.
Hawk Nelson, I think, pretty sure they're Canadian.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
So
I know
in
some of the
2020,
Steingarts.
he said on Instagram, I've deconstructed my faith.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. He said it was like a sweater where I pulled threads, and then pretty soon there was no sweater left. And he walked away from his faith. He didn't become an atheist, but he walked away from his Christian faith. And I actually did a movie based on one of my books called The Case for Heaven, a documentary. And we interviewed him for that movie. And he talked about this in the movie. And the argument is basically, okay, if God is real, then he would make his existence so obvious to us because he loves us and he wants to have a relationship with us. He wouldn't play hide and seek with us. He would be much more apparent and obvious if that were. And that's an interesting objection. So in my new book, Is God Real? I have a whole chapter where I address this objection. And it's interesting when you think about it because the guy I interviewed, the expert on it, is a guy named Kenneth Samples. And he was an aspiring baseball player. And he was a catcher. And he said, I think of this issue as a pitcher and a catcher, the hiddenness of God. He said, God is the pitcher and I'm the catcher. He said, where is the problem really? Is it with the pitcher or is it with the catcher? And he said, biblically, I would say the problem is with the catcher. And I said, why? He said, because when you look biblically, Romans 1 verse 20, it says that we have enough evidence from nature itself to know that God exists. And in fact, it says the evidence is so strong, we're without excuse. And yet it says that we tend to suppress that. And the Greek imagery there is like a pedal. And so the apparent existence of God creeps up in our life and we push it down like a pedal. And then another time it creeps up again and then we push it down again. And it does it again and again. And so it's like a pedal. We keep suppressing the evidence of God and the truth that God exists. And so he says biblically, I think the problem mainly lies with us. Why? Well, just like Kanye West said recently, I am God. I am the God of me. We want to be God. We don't have room in our life for another God. We don't want there to be another God. Thomas Nagel, the famous atheist philosopher, said, it's not just that I don't believe in God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want to live in a universe that is like that. So we have a tendency to want to be God in our life. And then William Lane Craig had an interesting comment on this. He said,
who you quote in every book, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Or almost every book.
Yeah, for sure. Bill Craig said, God's goal is not for us just to know that he exists. God walks a fine line. He wants to make himself as readily obvious to those who really want to find him, but sufficiently hidden for those that don't want to find him, because he doesn't want to overwhelm us and take away our free will by, overwhelming us with his presence. So Bill Craig said God's goal is not just that we know that he exists, but that we enter into a relationship with him, that we love him, that we follow him, that we have a saving relationship with him. He said even the demons believe that God exists. Doesn't help them. If God made his existence so obvious, like he writes in neon in the sky, I'm here, God is here, or whatever, how do we know that more people would come into that kind of a relationship with him? We don't really know. If God is omniscient, he would know the line to walk. He would know how the degree to which make his existence obvious to people so that the maximum number of people would come into that saving relationship. And as one person said to me, he said, look at the times in history where God did make himself as obvious as the nose on your face. I'm thinking of when he dealt with Israel, when he led them through the desert, when he parted the Red Sea. I mean, how much more evidence do you want that God is real? But what happened? Did Israel then fall into line? No, Israel fell into apostasy again. And so there's no guarantee that even if God made himself totally obvious, that we would then follow him and enter into a relationship with him. There's going to be those that, no, I want to be God. I'm God. I'm the God of me. And we will reject him anyway. So there's a lot of dynamics to this. And I have a chapter in my book, Is God Real?, that really kind of goes into depth and looks at this issue of the hiddenness of God. And one of the things that John Steingart admitted in an interview later, he said, this question of God's hiddenness does not negate the other affirmative evidence that God exists. And we have a lot of evidence from science, from philosophy, from history that Christianity is true. And it doesn't negate that. It raises questions and it raises doubts. And many people are wrestling with that. And, I'd encourage them to read that chapter. I think it'll be helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I'm glad you raised the parting of the Red Sea, because I love reading the scripture, not just for the revelation of God and his divineness, but also for the human response.
Yeah.
You could easily make the argument. I'm sure there were some people that day who are like, yeah, we made it through the sea, but there was a strong east wind.
Yeah, right.
Which the scripture actually says there was a strong east wind.
Right.
And then it was just the wind. Or, yeah, we're in the desert, but I remember the, leeks and watermelons and cucumbers. And can we go back? Like, come on, can we go back to Egypt? Like, and sometimes as a leader, you expect was it Buechner who wrote, imagine that one day in the stars in every language, all the stars align to read in every language known to humanity. I exist, God.
Yeah.
And we'd all stop and we'd all hold our breath for a second. And then someone would go, and?
Yeah.
And we get on with our lives again.
Right.
And it's like, there's a lot of truth to that,
There
right?
There is. And if God wrote in the sky, I'm here, we'd think, wow, look at those airplanes that do the skywriting. Isn't that amazing how they can do that?
Right, yeah.
And we'd find a way to walk the other way if indeed we're motivated by a desire to be our own gods.
Or in today's world, the world is round, God. It's like, no, it's not, it's flat, right? And on that note, when you first released, like in the 90s, The Case for Faith and The Case for Christ, et cetera, information was still scarce. It was the 90s. The internet isn't what we know it to be. I used to get 6 emails a day kind of thing, and you couldn't really Google anything. Google was a baby. And obviously that's changed. And now you've got YouTube, TikTok, social media, Google, AI, information everywhere. And now you've got a generation, digital natives are now in their late 30s.
Right.
And they're used to finding their own truth. This goes back to a little bit of what we're talking about. But, I want to dive into very specifics before we wrap up. But are there, how has that changed the game for those of us who believe that there's an objectivity, who believe that there is some, substance to the faith that we profess? Are you finding you have to work twice as hard now that everyone has, quote, access to information, a lot of which is just misinformation or not very well thought through, and everybody's an expert? I read 2 books, now I'm an expert.
Right.
So,
Ronald Nash, who was a scholar, wrote a book before he died toward the end of the 20th century, I think it was, late 90s or early 2000s, called God and the Greeks. And it was a book about refuting this idea of Jesus as a myth. It's called mythicism, and we see this propagated on the internet. So in the introduction to that book, he said, basically, I don't know why I'm writing this book. He said, the idea that Jesus is a myth was propagated back in the late 1800s.
I was going to say, that's been around for a minute. Yeah,
exactly. And he said in the 1900s, early part of the century, the 20th century, the 1900s, it was completely debunked. But now it's come back. So now I got to write another book refuting it. And he couldn't understand what is going on. And what was going on was the advent of the internet. Because people would take all these old arguments that have been long since refuted and rebutted, and they breathe fresh air into them and say, maybe Jesus never existed. Maybe he's a myth. Maybe he's like Osiris or Mithras or these other ancient myths that were popular in the ancient world and so forth. Well, it's bunk. And it's been disproven for a long time, but now it has a new life because of the internet. And so you're right. We're so inundated with misinformation and information. I remember there was an atheist who has a popular presence on the internet, and he wrote a critique of something that I was involved in. And I sat down and I wrote a 4,000-word rebuttal, pointing out his errors and misinformation. And then I thought, what do I even do with this? if I publish it, it's going to feed people say, yeah, but what about this or what about that? And you're right. We live in an era where we're inundated with all kinds of stuff, and the idea of how do we discern what is reliable and what is not reliable? What's coming from a person who's read a couple of books versus a person who has a PhD and 20 years of experience as a professor at a major university? And these days, a lot of people don't see the dividing line between those.
Well, and anti-institutionalism, anti-intellectualism, anti-authoritarian. Well, I'm not a fan of authoritarianism, but anti-authority is what I'm trying to say. Right. Yeah. And you're right. If you publish that 4,000 word piece, that could have been the rest of your career right there. Just responding to everybody who's it. And, it goes back to where we were talking about a few minutes ago. I wonder if the future is relational, informational. It's information in the context of relationship.
That's why I love these small groups for non-believers. These we call spiritual discovery groups. You call them alpha groups. Yeah. We actually experimented with these years ago in Chicago in the 1990s. I brought in a guy named Gary Poole, who was like at the time and still is, I think, the world's leading expert on doing these groups. And we said, Gary, start these groups and let's track people. Let's do this scientifically. So pretty soon he had 1,100 non-believers in these groups, dozens and dozens of these groups. And we tracked them over a period of years. And guess what we found out? 80% of them came to faith in Christ.
Wow.
Where do you get an 80% conversion rate? And it's because, as you say, people these days, many of them are more interested in story than they are in statistics. And to give them an opportunity to sit down and not be lectured to by the leader of the group. We teach the leaders of these groups how not to answer questions. We don't want them giving answers. We want them asking more questions. So I'll give you an example, and this is how apologetics is changing because of what you've talked about. Years ago, when I would get into a conversation with a non-believer, I would often ask the question, hey, let me just ask you a question. If you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? Well, 80% of the time, and that's pretty much documented, 80% of the time, the question is going to be some permutation of why does a loving God allow suffering in the world? If God is real, why does he allow suffering? So what I used to do and say, oh, that's a great question. I used to have that when I was an atheist. Let me give you a little 5-point sermon on why God allows suffering. And then I would unpack the reasons behind suffering. I don't do that anymore, thanks to Gary Poole's coaching in my life. So what I do now is I ask a question. If you could ask God any one question, you knew he'd give you an answer, what would you ask? Well, I'd ask, why does God, if he's loving, allow suffering? Now I say, wait a minute. Of all the potential questions in the universe, why did you ask that one? Well, now they get personal. Now they get real. And now they say, because my wife was just diagnosed with cervical cancer, and I want to know where's God in the middle of that? Or we lost a baby in childbirth 5 years ago. Where was God when that was going on? Now you get to the emotional side, the raw side of it. And that person at that moment does not need me to give them a 5-point sermon on why God allows suffering. That person needs me to put my arm around their shoulder and to weep with them and to be Jesus with them and to love them and to encourage them and to point them toward hope. That's what that person needs from me at that time. So apologetics has to shift in this world and deal not just with the empirical, not just with the facts, not just with the evidence, but we got to get down to why are people asking these questions? What is motivating them to have these doubts? Let's get to that level and let's talk at that level. And often those are emotional issues that need more of a counseling gift than they do an apologetics background.
Well, and back to the relational crisis we're in, most people have no one to share it with. I remember when our church was smaller, and I still used to take random appointments from people who would come in and just want to talk to the pastor. And they would unload truth bombs on me, like, thinking of leaving my wife or have the secret life or whatever it was. And I barely know their name. And I would ask them, one of the questions I would always ask, obviously I'd listen, I'd pray with them, sometimes I'd weep with them. But I'd always ask them, who else are you talking to about this? And the number one answer was nobody. And they, even back then, They didn't have friends.
Yeah. So many churches too have small groups, but the small groups are often just an excuse for socialize. And I remember when I was in a men's small group, I was a new Christian. I was not on the staff of church, just a guy. And we had like 5 guys in this group. And we get together. And if you asked us, do you talk about deep stuff? Oh, yeah. Did we talk about deep stuff? No. We talked about the Cubs and the Bears and the White Sox and, that kind of stuff. And then one day, I'll never forget this. We were at a restaurant and kind of in a corner. And we're going around saying, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing good. And this is going on. And it got to the guy next to me. And I said, how you doing? And he burst into tears. And he said, my marriage is falling apart. And I'm about to lose my wife. And I don't know what to do.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, that veneer, those surface level interactions of our group was shattered forever. And we gathered around him and we wept with him and we prayed with him and we gave him biblical counsel and things were never the same again, because from then on we knew this is a safe place and we can go deep and we can talk about it. But he had the guts and the desperation, frankly, at that moment to break through that veneer. And, so many Christians are in, accountability groups or small groups, and they're just excuses to get together and talk about surface level biblical stuff or whatever. And we need to have a breakthrough like that to get it to a level where we're really sharing the depths of our heart.
Well, I think that's really powerful. I was going to do a lightning round where I ask you some of the toughest questions and give me 60 seconds, but maybe we'll save that for round 2 down the road.
Sure.
Because I think you're right. If you can get to the question under the question, if you can find out what's really going on, because somebody asks you, if God is so loving, why is there a hell? They're thinking probably about someone they really care about who doesn't know Christ or has a different faith view, et cetera, et cetera. So the Apologetics Pyramid, do you want to talk about that a little bit? What is that?
This is interesting. I have a chapter in my book, Is God Real? And it's called the Apologetics Pyramid. And what that means is it started back when I was a pastor and I had just preached a sermon on the evidence for the resurrection. And I was greeting people afterwards, and an atheist came up to me and said, hey, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist, but what you said today is really kind of challenging. And he said, would you be willing to get together this week and talk to me about it? And I said, man, I'd love to, but I'm leaving for Europe this afternoon. I'm going to be gone for a month. But my friend will talk to you. And I saw my friend over here. His name was Chad. Chad was a seminary student and loved apologetics and so forth. And so I said, Chad, come over here. And I introduced him. And Chad said, yeah, come over to my house Friday night for pizza and let's talk. So Chad knows he's got this atheist coming over to his house. And he's thinking, how do I build the case, so to speak, for Christianity with him? So he develops what he calls, and by the way, Chad today is one of the leading Christian philosophers in the world. He's a university professor. He's written, I don't know how many books about philosophy. He got his PhD at Marquette University. Anyway, he's come a long way.
What's his last name?
Meister, Chad Meister.
Chad Meister.
Chad Meister. So anyway, he develops this pyramid. And what it means is, if you picture a pyramid, he starts out with the broadest question, which is exactly what you and I talked about earlier. What is truth? That's the base. So let's get on the same page. The truth is that which corresponds to reality. So you talk that through. Then you go to the next stage, which is worldviews. And as I said earlier, there's only 3 possible worldviews, spiritually speaking. Theism, there is a God. Atheism, there is no God. Or pantheism, everything is God. Well, let's test those by looking at, are they livable and are they logical? And so he talked through that with them and realized that only theism really survives. So that goes to the next level of theism. And it said, let's talk about the evidence for theism from science, from philosophy. And he talked about that. Then the next level is revelation. Can we trust the Bible? What are some reasons that we find the New Testament to be credible in terms of what it tells us about Jesus and his resurrection and so forth? So that's the next level. And then the next level, as you're getting closer to the peak, is resurrection, because that's the linchpin of everything. Jesus clearly claimed to be the Son of God. At one point, he got up before a group and he said, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in essence. We're one in nature. And the audience understood what he was saying because they picked up stones to kill him. They said, you're just a man and you're claiming to be God. So the resurrection either proved that he was telling the truth or unmasked him as a false Messiah. Well, so you talk about the resurrection and the evidence that shows that he was telling the truth about his identity of being the Son of God. And then you get to the peak, which is the gospel. So he draws this pyramid with this guy. The guy comes over at 7:00 or so in the evening. They have pizza. They talk through it. And by, I think, midnight or so, that atheist was now a follower of Jesus. He came to faith that night. And so Chad actually wrote a book about this called Building Belief. And you can still get it on Amazon. I think it's out of print, but it's still available. And I interviewed him for my book, Is God Real? And he just kind of walks through this pyramid. But it's kind of a handy tool to go from point A, what is truth, to the gospel. And
well, I think you're right. If you stop at the top of the pyramid, you haven't worked your way through some of the foundational suppositions that people hold, and it tends to collapse.
Exactly.
Wow. Super helpful. What is different about this book from other books you've written?
Well, it's kind of an A to Z. The Case for Christ really dealt with my spiritual journey and the things I investigated that brought me to faith. And it was largely focused on the reliability of the Gospels and the resurrection of Jesus. I do cover that in Is God Real? We have a chapter on the resurrection and the evidence for the resurrection and so forth, and the Apologetics Pyramid and so forth. But I also have 3 chapters on something I find fascinating, which is how discoveries in 3 areas of science over just the last 50 to 80 years point powerfully and persuasively toward God being real. I mean cosmology, the origin of the universe, physics, the fine-tuning of the universe, and DNA or biological information inside every cell in our body.
Can you give us one quick snippet of that?
Yeah. Well, the cosmological argument. Where did the universe come from? For centuries, scientists believed the universe was eternal. But now, because of philosophical arguments, but also a series of scientific discoveries about the expansion of the universe, virtually every scientist now believes the universe had a beginning at some point in the past. Well, that leads to an argument that Dr. William Lane Craig has popularized. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. We now know that the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause behind it. And then you look at, well, what kind of a cause can bring a universe into existence? It must be transcendent because it's separate from creation. It must be spirit or immaterial because it existed before the physical world. It must be eternal or timeless because it existed before physical time came into being. It must be powerful given the immensity of the creation event. Must be smart given the precision of the creation event. Must be personal because they had to make the decision to create. Must be creative because look at the universe, how creative that is. Must be caring or loving because he's so carefully crafted a habitat for us to flourish in. And the scientific principle of Occam's razor would tell us there'd be just one creator. So you look at that and you say, wait a second, transcendent, spirit, eternal, powerful, smart, personal, creative, loving, unique. That's a description of the God of the Bible. And so, and it rules out, by the way, polytheistic religions because there'd be just one creator. It rules out pantheistic religions because God is separate from creation. So there's a lot you can do with just that one argument for the existence of God. So I deal with cosmology, the fine-tuning of the universe, how that defies the explanation. It could have happened by chance. The information inside every cell in your body. You have 100 trillion cells in your body. And inside every cell is a strand of DNA that's 6 feet tall. And embedded in that DNA is a 4-letter chemical alphabet that spells out the precise assembly instructions for every protein out of which you're made. So just as English uses a 26-letter alphabet to spell out words, inside every cell is a 4-letter chemical alphabet that spells out the assembly instructions for building us. And whenever you see information like that, always there's an intelligence behind it. And I interviewed Dr. Stephen Meyer, PhD from Cambridge University, who's one of the leading proponents of this argument and goes through all the possible objections to it and so forth. It's a powerful argument for God's existence because I'll leave you with this. Nature can produce patterns, but it can't produce information. So in other words, inside every cell is more information, more words than 200 years of the Sunday New York Times. Okay, in every cell in your body. Where does information come from? If you're walking down a beach and in the wet sand you see ripple marks, it is logical to say, oh, the waves created those ripple marks. But if you're walking down the beach and in the wet sand you see God loves Mary with a heart around it and an arrow through it, you would never say, oh, the waves created that. Mm-hmm. Why? Because whenever you see information, whether it's a computer code, a newspaper, or a painting on a cave wall, there's always an intelligence behind it. So I build these scientific arguments, some philosophical reasoning, and then the historical evidence for the resurrection, all in one book, Is God Real? To kind of give a one-shop stopping place for people who are curious.
So I want to, maybe this is just an indication of some of the people I hang out with, or what I listen to. But I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but I'd like you to play along.
Yeah.
Because I've heard this more than once.
Yeah.
You gave that beautiful 5-minute summation.
Yeah.
Here's a response, and I want you to react to it.
Yeah.
That's cool, man. I just think we're all part of the simulation,
Possible. It is possible. It is possible that it is. Really? Yeah, that's one. It is possible. But does it make sense? Is that where the evidence really points? Because I have a lot more than just the scientific arguments. I have the philosophical arguments and I have the historical data as well. But you can't really disprove the idea that you are a brain in a vat that some alien is stimulating, and that's why you're thinking these. You can't disprove that. Absolutely. But is it the best, most logical option? Do you want to believe that when the evidence points over here toward God and toward Christianity being true and fits it like a glove? Is that an excuse or is that a legitimate alternative?
Okay, that's fun. I'm glad you played along. You know what I believe? Deep down, I really believe half the people who think it's part of the simulation have no idea what they're saying. They just heard it from somebody else.
They saw the Matrix.
They saw the Matrix. Yeah, exactly. They saw the Matrix, so they watched this 2-minute video clip on YouTube, and they're like, "Yeah, I think we're all part of the simulation," or they heard it on a podcast or something. Right. It's just, I think a lot of our understanding, and this is why I'm really grateful for your work, and I'm really grateful for conversations like this. A lot of our beliefs are so shallowly rooted. Yeah. And that's true of Christianity too. If you look at the Wave of Deconversion, there's a whole lot of Christians who just weren't particularly well tethered to it. And, when you look at the volume of information that probably now tilts against Christianity as opposed to for it, just in terms of pure volume, I'm not saying in terms of persuasiveness. It's no wonder we're seeing this. Lee, we've covered so much, and I hope this isn't our last conversation.
I hope not.
Anything else you want to share before we wrap up, or things we didn't touch on that we should be touching on?
Just one quick thing, and that is when we talk about apologetics, which of course mean not to apologize for anything, but giving a defense for the faith, giving evidence for the faith. I think it's really important that we always keep in mind it's all about evangelism. Our goal is not to win an argument. It's to reach a person with the gospel of Jesus Christ and see them come to a saving relationship with the Lord of the universe. That's our goal. And sometimes apologists can lose sight of that, and it becomes a game. It becomes a scholarly ivory tower exercise. No, it's not. Lives and souls are at stake. My goal, I'm not an apologist. I'm an evangelist. I use apologetics to help reach people with the gospel and the truth of Christianity. But I don't want to ever lose sight of the fact that it is a tool. Martin Luther said, apologetics is a handmaiden of evangelism. It's important And I think apologetics is increasingly important. My friend J. Warner Wallace, who was an atheist cold case homicide investigator who investigated Christianity, became a Christian and an apologist, said recently that evangelism in the 21st century is spelled apologetics. In other words, I think it's going to become increasingly important as we define truth, as we build the case and so forth in the coming years. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's because we love people, because they're made in God's image, because they're precious, because we want to see them in heaven forever. That's our motivation, not just to get into, clashing swords over facts and statistics and things like that. I mean, my personal goal in life is to drag as many people to heaven with me as I can. That's my goal. And if I can use apologetics as a tool, great. If I use something else, great. But that's my goal. So I just want to raise that as a caution flag as we talk about apologetics.
If it becomes a sword, you're kind of in trouble. Yes. I would agree with that. Yes. And I learned this from Reggie Joyner years ago. Above all else, preserve the relationship. Because if you have relationship, you have influence.
Yeah.
And if you lose the relationship, you lose influence. Thank you, Reggie, for that nugget. Lee, if we want to be more acquainted with where you are online these days and your work, what is the best place to go?
Yeah, LeeStrobel.com is kind of my home base. If they're interested in our center at Colorado Christian University, our Center for Apologetics and Evangelism, they can go to strobelcenter.com. We have undergraduate degrees and master's degrees in apologetics and evangelism, fully online, fully accredited. And anybody interested in that can go to strobelcenter.com and get information there.
And the book is called Is God Real? Available widely everywhere you get books. Lee, thank you for decades and decades of helping leaders like me and thousands of listeners who are listening right now. Really grateful for you and delighted that this conversation finally has happened. Thank you for
what you do and who you are and the influence you've got on so many lives and on my life. So thank you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
We will. Thank you, Lee.
God bless.